Welcome back. As we pick up our story, Paul and his team have now left Corinth and they're headed to, they've left Athens and they're headed to Corinth. Corinth is another one of those very important cities in the Roman Empire. They were mostly important for their economy. They had all kinds of stuff from brass work to shipbuilding, and so it was a very famous city for its wealth and its businesses. It was also famous for its corruption. We have different cities in the world today that are known for being corrupt. Corinth in the first century was known for lying, cheating, stealing, fraud, and it was so corrupt that in the first century, if you cheated someone, they called it to Corinthianize. Corinth was so corrupt that it became a word used to refer to corruption. And this is now where Paul goes for his next leg of ministry in his second missionary journey. While he was there, he met a couple named Aquila and Priscilla. These are believers that had been in the city of Rome and had left the city of Rome and made their way to Corinth. They were tent makers like Paul. Usually, tent makers in the New Testament were leather workers. They were not just makers of tents, they were workers in leather, and they made a variety of different kinds of things. And at least initially, when Paul went to Corinth, he earned extra money to continue his ministry by working with leather, by being a tent maker. That was where he met Priscilla and Aquila, apparently, and they did some work together. Later in Corinth, Paul stops doing the work and devotes the work of leather making and devotes all of his attention to the spread of the gospel. But that was where he met Priscilla and Aquila. As was his custom, he went to the synagogue. And as this Jewish Pharisee, every time he went to the synagogue, he was invited to speak. Again, we've said this before, that was simply the way it was done in the first century. Eventually, the Jews in the synagogue rejected the gospel, and Paul left the synagogue. At this point, he does something that is unusual for him. He shook the dust off his robes, off his clothes, his jacket and pants, and he said, "Because you have rejected the gospel here in the synagogue in Corinth, I am now going to teach elsewhere." And he went next door and he began to teach in the home of one of the believers there. The believer probably was another Jew who had been in the synagogue, had accepted Christ, and had then invited Paul to use his large home as a place to teach. I say probably, it's not fully clear, but that's probably the best way it would have happened. And then we discover that many people, not just Gentiles, but many people leave the synagogue that has rejected Paul, and they go starting to listen to Paul in this house next door, because many people, Jews, Gentiles, men, women, slaves, and free, are turning to the gospel because of Paul's ministry. Now, normally what happens with Paul right about this time in his ministry is that the Jews get jealous. And they create a riot, or they create problems, and Paul is forced to leave the town. In this particular case, something unusual happened. Paul had a vision, and Paul does not do this on a regular basis. He mentions it a couple of times, but visions are not normally the way God communicated with Paul. In this case, he had a vision where God said, "Don't be afraid. You are going to be safe. I want you to stay in Corinth longer." So Paul, knowing now that God was going to keep him safe, was continuing his ministry. Instead of being run out of town, he was able to continue to preach and teach and engage in conversation with people as they came to know the Lord. Eventually, it did happen. The Jews did get upset. He taught for quite a while, and then eventually the Jews decided that they were going to run him out of town. So they all got together, the Jews who did not like Paul, and they created some legal charges against him, and they took him to court. And they went to court and they said that Paul was teaching things that are illegal in the Roman Empire. They were teaching that there is another king, and that's illegal in Rome. So they took him to the Roman judge. The judge was a man named Gallio, and he was a fairly new judge, but he was also a very wise judge. So when they got to court, the Jews got up and they all declared that Paul is a bad man who is saying things that are illegal, and he is preaching a message that is not legal in Rome. Gallio listened to them for a few minutes and said, if you brought me a real criminal, or if you had actual charges, then I would hear this case. But what you're talking about is just religious words. You are only disagreeing about the words that you use in your own religion, and this is not the place for it. And he kicked them out of his court. At which point the Jews were angry. And so they beat their own leader, which makes no sense to us. It's unclear if they simply got excited and beat him because he was standing there, or if they blamed him for the failure. But whatever happened, their court was thrown out of, or their case was thrown out of court. They beat their own leader, and then it was time for Paul to move on. Interestingly, several of the leaders of the Jews in Corinth are named in Scripture as having come to Christ through all of this. One of the things that's exciting about the life of Paul is that everywhere he goes, he preaches with boldness, and people respond. It's something sometimes in the 21st century we forget. When we preach the gospel, it demands a response. People either accept it or they reject it. But there is also always a response. And often in Paul's case, when people rejected the gospel, they were very aggressive. They stoned him, they flogged him, they jailed him, they ran him out of town, they tried to kill him. And of course, that was the kind of thing that happened here again. So he gets rejected again, and then a while later, it's time to leave. It does not appear that that there was violence. The judge was now, the Roman judge was now probably paying attention. But it became time for Paul to leave, and when he left, he took Priscilla and Aquila with him. They had now joined his party. And so he took Priscilla and Aquila with him. And then it says in Scripture in Acts chapter 18, it says that they got to the city of Cenchrea, which is a port city. He's getting ready to get on a boat and travel back to Jerusalem. When it says he cut his hair. Now, we usually miss that kind of thing because we don't really care very much how long Paul's hair was. But it's an interesting reminder here. Paul had made a vow. And it's a reminder that Paul continues to identify himself as a Jew. He is a Jewish Pharisee through his entire ministry. And the vow was probably, it does not articulate this, doesn't tell us what it meant, but it was probably a Nazirite vow from the Old Testament. And what would happen would be a good Jew, as a gesture of thanksgiving, or perhaps other things, but maybe in this case thanksgiving, would make a vow not to cut their hair for a certain period of time. And at the end of that time, they would shave their hair off and then burn the hair as an offering, usually of thanks. So one possibility here is that Paul had made a vow of thanks to God after God protected him in Corinth. You'll remember the vision that was there. You can stay, I'm going to protect you, don't be afraid. So one possibility is that he made, as a Jewish man, he made this Jewish vow that grew his hair out until a certain time had passed. He cut his hair, and then was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem so that he could burn that hair as a sacrifice to the Lord. Again, we're guessing just a little bit on how that worked because it's not clear. But that would be consistent with something a Jewish man in the first century would do. So they get on the boat, they travel across to Ephesus, we're told, where the leaders in Ephesus asked Paul to stay. That does not happen often. Usually Paul is asked to leave. But in this case, they asked Paul to stay, and because he was in a hurry to get to Jerusalem, for reasons he does not tell us, he said he could not stay, but he hoped he would be back. Priscilla and Aquila did stay, and then Paul hurried on to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, it does not tell us more of what he did. It's safe to assume that he went to the temple, that he burned this hair as the conclusion of his vow, that he thanked God in that way. He probably met with some of the leaders in Jerusalem, but again, it does not tell us that. And then he went back to Syrian Antioch to report on what happened with this second missionary journey. And that really is where Paul's second missionary journey ends. We'll pick it up with our next class.